Itamar, thanks a lot for that introduction and for drawing attention to my Twitter persona. And also thanks to everyone for inviting me here, for taking the time from your busy schedules to attend the talk. And I hope that in future I get to see you in person for the first time. Most of you, Itamar, after a while as well. This is joint work that I'm going to be talking today. Joint work with my BS colleagues Sebastian Deur, Leo Gambacorta, and Dan Rees. The usual disclaimer applies. Any views are ours and not necessarily those of the BIS. So in the interest of time, let me just jump directly into it. So with the advent of large language models, we have seen generative artificial intelligence being kind of catapulted into popular discourse. And this is in no small part because it has transformed the way in which people interact with computers, away from code and programming interfaces and more towards ordinary text and speech. So it has reduced substantially the barriers to entry. Now, to be sure, there are a wide range of views on AI and its effects. These range from, say, outright skepticism and dismissal as a sort of a nothing burger, in one extreme, and then there is another extreme that thinks that general artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence is usually called AGI is really around the corner and will soon be we'll all be soon fully overtaken by machines. Now, be that as it may, I think it is fair to say that recent advances in AI have raised hopes of a boost to economic growth. And this has led some informed scholars to argue that AI is, or has the potential to be, rather, quote unquote, the most important general purpose technology of our era. A key channel through which AI can affect economic growth is through improvements in productivity, as was highlighted by the task-based framework of Acemoglu and Restrepo. And indeed, the recent inroads of AI tools in particular have triggered hopes of widespread efficiency gains. And the available empirical evidence really suggests as much. There is, in fact, growing evidence that Gen AI can lead to productivity gains for workers, especially those that requires relatively higher cognitive skills, or for those occupations that require higher cognitive skills. But there is also evidence that the AI can boost firm growth and innovation among other outcomes. Now, most of these studies, as we said, are kind of narrow in scope, but there is also a key macro dimension, which is that by transforming occupational tasks and affecting production efficiency, AI may also have significant consequences beyond labor market, also for firms and for industries as a whole. And in this context, another item on which there is broad agreement as well is that AI will be positive for productivity. So I have yet to find anyone saying that it can subtract from productivity, unless you spend a lot of time fooling around with ChatGPT. There is also broad agreement, of course, that this is a general purpose technology, or GPT, not to be confused with the GPT in ChatGPT. This is an acronym that we economists have coined some while back. Now, that said, there's also broad agreement as well that there is going to be heterogeneity because of the reason I mentioned before, that there is differences in terms of cognitive abilities by occupation in how different occupations are exposed to AI. So there is some heterogeneity in how AI will affect different roles, and this will depend on their skill content. So therefore, it is important to also consider various occupational tasks and their exposure to AI. So against this background, what we do in the paper is we set out to answer what are the effects of AI on aggregate output and inflation, as well as output and employment across different industries. And we do so by first constructing a measure of exposure to AI at the two-digit industry level, according to the North American Industry Classification System, the NAICS. And we build here on a measure that was recently introduced by NYU's Felten and a few co-authors, which has established itself within this literature pretty solidly, I would say. I have a bit more to say on this on the measure in a few slides, but in a nutshell, what the measure does is combine survey evidence on the extent to which AI applications can be used in different workplace abilities, with information on the importance of these various abilities in different occupations, and then you can aggregate from occupations to industries as well. The idea here is that a higher score in this AI-IE measure indicates that an industry has many occupations in which AI can be used. We then use this to calibrate a macro model in which AI is effectively a permanent increase in the level of productivity, which has a differential effect across sectors. And in particular, we assume that AI raises annual productivity growth by 1.5 percentage points over the next decade, in line with what we consider to be plausible estimates in the literature. Now, to be fair, given the prominence of the author, I have to say that most recently Daron Acemoglu presented more modest estimates, and the people at Goldman Sachs, which provided some of the other estimates on which we base our work, also provide a nice contrast between their approach, which we largely follow, and Acemoglu. So I'm happy to share that note with anyone that is interested on the topic, because I think they provide a very nuanced case for both views. So what we do is we allocate this aggregate productivity increase across sectors, and for this we use our exposure measure basically. Now, in addition to the usual set of nominal and real rigidities that are used in this type of models to account for aggregate fluctuations, the model also features a detailed industry structure on both the demand side and the production side. And this allows it to account for industry-specific shifts in consumer preferences and work practices, as well as industry-level and aggregate transmission mechanisms of AI. In the baseline model, we'll focus on 20 industries, which broadly encompass consumption goods that are closer to final demand, but also intermediate goods and investment goods. And whenever convenient for expositional purposes, we'll aggregate these 20 into five aggregate sectors.
Then Iñaki,
yes.
We have a question from the audience.
Yes.
From Daniel.
Hi, Aldasoro. I have a quick question. Maybe I missed it because I joined a tiny bit late. So the AI is a productivity shock. Why is it different than any other productivity shock? Like a general question. How does a productivity shock affect inflation and other things you're examining here? What's so special about the AI? The magnitude of it? The fact that it's broader? What's special about it?
Well, I mean, in a way, the way we started the project, and I don't want to give away too much early on here, but it's through the reflection that this, in essence, is a general purpose technology, and then it's like an aggregate TFP shock. You can think in terms of a usual aggregate TFP shock in a single sector economy, but here there is an important dimension that is different exposures across occupations. So that's the angle that we wanted to explore. So, thinking in terms of if you wanted to go further back in time, like traditional RBC, the TFP shock, that's what we have in mind ultimately. It is large. That's also true, but that's just calibration, right? I mean, we could as well just make it smaller, and then the results would scale, and maybe dynamics would change slightly, but that's it. So I think the intuition that you have is.
So the anticipating your results. So it's the fact that the shock affects different sectors in different ways. That's going to be driving the results, or
maybe if you hold on for one slide to two slides, then I'll get to that.
All right.
Because it's coming right away.
All right.
Okay, sorry, I'm anticipated now the slide. So I was describing the exposure measure, the model, and then what we do is we use the calibrated model as a sort of a laboratory to study the effects on macro aggregates and industrial sectors, and then we do is to perform counterfactual analysis. Now, before summarizing the results, and then maybe this also goes a bit in the direction of the question. Let me emphasize what we consider to be two appealing features of our approach. First is that we have an industry-specific measure of AI exposure, which is combined with a model that helps us discipline our thinking. And second is the fact that we perform this, the flexibility of the model basically allows us to perform counterfactual exercises. So there is a quote that I like a lot from Groucho Marx, which says, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others. So we have a certain set of assumptions, but if you disagree, and there is a lot of scope for reasonable disagreement here, I have to say, then the model is flexible enough to accommodate other assumptions and then explore their implications. And then I think it's also worth noting a couple more things just to clarify, and maybe this preempts a couple of questions as well along the way. The AI exposure measure that we are using is, let me be clear about this, is silent about substitution and complementarity, right? It has nothing to say about whether AI will substitute or complement any given occupation, which is of course a very important issue. This has been explored to some extent in recent work over the past 6 months or so by colleagues at the IMF. Now, our approach is that rather than introducing our judgment as to which specific occupation, we have to do this judgmentally occupation by occupation. So which specific occupation is more or less substitutable or complementary, we rather let the labor market dynamics play out in the model and then see which other sectors where hours work go up or go down. And second, we conceive of AI as affecting aggregate TFP rather than being a factor-specific shock, and this is something that we will explore in one of the counterfactuals. So now to preview our findings, starting with macro and then with industry results. So we find that AI significantly increases output, consumption, and investment in both the short term and the long run. And this reflects the positive effect of higher productivity growth and economic capacity. So this is kind of, in a way, is what you would expect from this kind of generalized GPT as a general purpose technology. Now, for inflation, it turns out that the expectation formation of agents in the model will turn out to matter for the path, but not necessarily for the final destination. So we're going to end up pretty much in the same way, regardless of expectations. But the dynamics as we get there are gonna differ. And in particular, when the effects of AI are fully unanticipated, then the initial supply shock of increased productivity can act as a disinflationary force. And this is because this enters directly into the marginal cost equation, so it lowers them on impact, whereas demand usually takes a bit more time to pick up due to frictions that are in the model, such as habits in consumption or adjustment costs in investment. Now, at the same time, AI will increase income and therefore will also increase aggregate demand, which then will generate the need for more investment to expand the capital stock and intermediate goods. And eventually, just general equilibrium effects due to higher consumption and investment will increase aggregate demand and therefore wages enough to make AI an inflationary force. Then we have policy rates, which will roughly respond to inflation following a Taylor type rule that we have in the model. So there's nothing particularly out of the ordinary here. So that was as far as unanticipated effects are concerned. When the effects of AI are fully anticipated by households and firms, which are the main agents in the model, then the main difference is that demand will increase already today in anticipation of future productivity increases. So think about permanent income by hypothesis type of argument, as households basically bring forward consumption. And this means that there's not going to be an initial disinflationary period. In this case, it's going to be inflation already going up in the short term. Now, in terms of industry results, what we find is that, of course, it is positive for all industries, which is unsurprising. It's a general purpose technology, but yet there is some meaningful variation across industries, as we will see. And in terms of the industry findings, what I particularly found interesting is that one of the things that I found interesting is that industries with the largest increase in output see the largest declines in hour work and in relative prices. And the thing that I found most surprising is that the initial exposure of to AI across sectors, as calibrated from our measure, has very little relationship with the final impact on that industry's value added. And the reason here is that ultimately general equilibrium effects that arise from higher demand from for a sector's output will tend to matter much more than the initial increase in productivity, as is calibrated from our model. However, which sector is initially most affected by AI will still matter for the response in aggregate output and inflation. In our baseline calibration, which is based on this AI exposure measure, there's going to be limited cross-sectoral variation, as I will show you in one or two slides. Now, to be fair, we think of this AI-IE measure as providing a solid grounding for studying the impact of AI across sectors. But at the same time, we have to remain quite humble about our ignorance and the fact that substantial uncertainty still remains regarding the effects of AI across industries. And our model allows us to contrast what would happen if AI, say, would be affecting, say, mostly the services sector or the manufacturing sector. And this is what we explore in a first counterfactual analysis, where AI affects only one sector at a time. And here the takeaway message is that this matters somewhat for the path of output, but especially for the path of inflation. And then in a second counterfactual analysis, we show that results are qualitatively unchanged if AI is a factor-specific technology, so say labor augmenting or capital augmenting rather than a general purpose technology. So with that, I kind of wrap up the first part of the presentation, which is introducing the key results. If there are no questions at this stage, I'm going to start by describing the measure of exposure to AI.
I have one question.
Yeah.
I guess it's anticipatory. Does the results, do they relate to I don't know, the formation of new sectors? It could be that AI would generate new job, new kind of job, new sectors that we're not even thinking about. Is it does it generalize to that scenario, or is it the composition is fixed?
This is a great question, and this is a question for which we the model really cannot answer. So we know from the history of past general purpose technologies that a significant chunk of their contribution actually comes from tasks that do not exist today. And I think there is this number by David Author which says that around, I don't know, something like 60 to 80% of the occupations that exist today or that generate employment today were not existent some like 80 years ago or something like that. So that, of course, we cannot know. I mean, we cannot speculate on which are new things that are going to be created, new tasks that are going to be created, new industries that are going to be created. And this is definitely a shortcoming of the model. But this is, of course, it's important. But you know, the model has its limits, and I think this is probably one of the most important ones, given the kind of the longer term type of analysis.
Would you say that your results are like a lower bound, if that's the
I would tend to think so. So if I wake up on a half glass half full kind of day, then I would definitely think so. Then in the glass half empty kind of day, when you think, oh, maybe labor disruptions are going to be too tough, and machines are going to take over many occupations, and it might be a bit more problematic. But I tend to be more on the optimistic side on this. So I tend to think that our results, if anything, are a bit more of a lower bound. So yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so coming back to slides, let me try to briefly explain how we go about constructing this measure of exposure to AI at the industry level. As I mentioned, this is work. This is based on the work of Ed Felten and co-authors. We construct this measure in 4 steps. So in the first step, we have 10 AI applications which cover AI's most likely use cases, and these are linked to a list of 52 workplace abilities. So what are these 10 applications? What are these 52 workplace abilities? So AI applications include the likes of image recognition, translation, reading comprehension, and so on and so forth. And the workplace abilities include the likes of, say, deductive reasoning, oral comprehension, stamina, finger dexterity, which might be an issue for different occupations to different degrees, and so on. And then for each ability, then there's going to be a survey respondents that would need to indicate whether they think the respective AI application can be used for that ability. And this would result in a so-called relatedness measure for each occupation ability combination that will range between 0, meaning no relation, to 1, meaning high relation. Then in a second step, each of these abilities exposures is gonna be constructed as a sum of the relatedness value across all of the 10 AI applications. So then it will range from 0 to 10, because the previous measure could range from 0 to 1, and we have 10 AI applications, so this one ranges from 0 to 10. And then in a third step, what we're going to do is we're going to compute each occupational exposure to AI, and this is the AIOE, the occupational exposure measure, which is the main thing that Felten and co-authors did in their paper. And this is done by taking the weighted average across the 52 abilities exposure to AI, with weights which are going to be given by the abilities prevalence in each occupation. And this is provided in a data set that I think kind of is dependent upon the BLS. I'm not entirely sure about that one. I don't recall at the moment. Then we standardize this resulting occupational exposure variable to range from 0 to 10, with again higher values indicating greater importance of AI within a given occupation. And then in the fourth and final step, we construct the exposure to AI at the industry level. So that's the AI-IE measure. And for this, we use data on occupations employment shares within each each two-digit industry, which this one for sure, I remember, is provided by the BLS. We use this as weights to average across the occupational exposure measures. And then we finally standardize this industry exposure measure so that the industry with the highest exposure value has a score of 1, and then all of the other industries exposure measure is expressed as a fraction of this highest exposure industry. So in a nutshell, what we do is we go from applications and ability to this relatedness measure, to ability exposure, to occupational exposure, and finally to industry exposure. One thing that is worth, yes.
We have one question. Sorry.
Sure.
Lila.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I have several questions with respect to the survey. I understand that the people that answer are from workplace, but what was the levels? Did you have like a variety of management, board members versus other regular, maybe middle career, and also newcomers, like young professionals? So this is one question. And then the second question is is connected to this, correlated to this, because what you did, you took the results of the survey, and then you build this mechanism of how to connect it to industries. But within the survey, you could have done, I'm not sure if you considered, maybe yes, and you have answered why it's not done, experimental survey that makes it a bit more scientific and not just kind of based on beliefs that may be impacted from the previous question, and things like that. This is more about the mechanism of the survey. Thank you very much.
So thanks. Thanks for these questions. So to be clear, we don't conduct the survey ourselves, right? So this comes from the paper by Felten. So let me be clear about that one. My memory may fail me here, but I believe the survey was conducted with the Amazon Turk service, actually. So I'm not sure about I don't recall that even in their paper they provide a split between, say, like managers and this kind of stuff. So for that, I would refer you to the paper by Felten, which I can share, by the way. It's kind of in an operations research type of journal. So we do not conduct the survey; it's conducted by them, and we take the results as given. But given that we build on their measure, we just fine tune towards the latter steps, basically step 4 and 3. We fine-tune it a bit for our purposes in terms of aggregation and coming up with more updated weights and so on. But we take their measures, including their survey, basically as given. Of course, I mean, the question that you raise are important. I believe they have some sort of discussion where they address or they try to address some of these issues, because evidently they also face this in the refereeing process as they went along with the paper. Okay. So one thing I should mention before moving on is that most measures of exposure to AI actually begin on step 3. So I think that's one reason why this measure has become, shortcomings notwithstanding, of course, it has become a bit established in the literature. So how does it look like at the occupational exposure? So this one is taken directly from Felten. This is again, this is occupational exposure, not industry exposure yet. But just to have an idea of what this indicates, so the highest occupational exposure scores are mostly for white-collar occupations that require advanced degrees. Think, genetic counselors, financial examiners, actuaries, and so on. And the lower scoring or the lowest scoring occupations are predominantly those that require quite a bit of physical effort. So think, for example, dancers, fitness trainers, and so on and so forth. Now, when we aggregate this to the industry level, and this is what we plot in this graph. So we have the gray bars, meaning the AIIE exposure measure in the gray bars, and then we have the respective employment shares in red diamonds, and then we have the 2-digit codes in the x-axis. What we find is that the industry with the highest industry exposure score is finance and insurance, and then it's followed by management of companies and enterprises. And then with the lowest score, we have the likes of, say, agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and also transportation and warehousing. So overall, I think this kind of makes some sense. It passed the smell test in terms of the type of activities done in these industries and their exposure, potential exposure to AI. However, I have to say that, as you can see from the gray bars, there is not a substantial degree of variation in exposure across industries. And the reason for this is that within the industries, there are a lot of occupations which are going to be having really various degrees of exposure to AI. And this is something that we will stress test the importance of, meaning this lack of variation in one of the counterfactual exercises. So now coming to the model, excuse me a second that I drink some water.
It's good that you drink water because we have another question.
Okay.
Anton?
Yes, thank you so much. Just a quick question about your chart. It does look that the AI creeps on the occupations with the highest wages and does not on the occupations with the lowest wages. Do you see any reduce in inequality from this? Maybe this question is too soon, but just a quick. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a good question. So I can answer outside of the model in our paper from my reading of the literature. So our model does not speak to inequality, but this is certainly an important issue. And here there are two arguments. So one is that you can have high exposure, but then at the end of the day you might be complemented, and that would be the case of the high cognitive workers that then would at the end of the day would see AI being a net positive for them. But it can also be substituted. And at the same time, what the empirical evidence finds in terms of productivity increases for specific occupations. So Leonardo, co-author of this paper, has another paper that will come out soon, in which they look at programming within a large database and a large experiment that Ant Group in China did. And what they find is that most of the productivity increases tend to be for coders, so a high cognitive skill occupation. But within coders, those that are kind of on the lower end of the distribution. So in some sense, it could also still be kind of an equalizer. But the jury is still out there, and our measure does not speak to that, as I mentioned early on. So it could very well increase inequality, but there's also arguments for why it may not. And then there's also a recent article by David Autor as well, and as well as a podcast, I think, in the Outlaws podcast, in which he makes the argument for why it could actually be a boon for the middle class. So I think kind of very reasonable people disagree on this on this important question. So let me leave it at that. But then emphasizing that it's very much an open question, and our paper does not really speak to inequality. So coming back to the model, very deliberately, I will not overwhelm you with any equations. For that, you are referred to the paper. We also have an extended online annex with the full model. The model is based on previous work by my BS colleague Dan Rees, the co-author of this paper as well. It's a quantitative multi-sector model that features a detailed industry structure both on demand and production sides. So we use the model to account for the direct effects of AI on industry level productivity, and then to trace through the effects of these changes across the economy to assess implications for aggregate outcomes. We have 4 types of agents in general in the model. So we have households, firms, the government, and the central bank. As usual, households make consumption, work, investment, savings decisions to maximize utility, lifetime utility under CES consumption and labor bundles, and all of this subject to an intertemporal budget constraint. The economy will also feature a given number of industries. fix again. So coming back to Itamar point, so there's not going to be more industries piling up on the economy. These industries will have many firms that will produce differentiated goods under monopolistic competition. There's also going to be a two-stage production process, and this is because we have these intermediate inputs. The prices of these intermediate inputs will create this network of linkages across the industries. Here, the idea is, for example, that higher productivity in manufacturing will lower costs for firms that operate in industries that use manufacturing goods as an input. There's going to be two factors in the model that dictate the importance of these inter-industry linkages. One is the weight of intermediate inputs in industry production functions, and second is the substitutability between intermediate inputs and other factors. Industries can also differ as well in their labor and capital intensity, as well as in the type of goods they produce, of course, and also the total factor productivity will be industry specific as well. The model also includes a number of nominal and real rigidities, the usual suspect that you would expect from the standard DSG literature. So, for example, firms face Calvo-style pricing rigidities, with the degree of price stickiness will be varying across industries. Households are also assumed to unionize, which gives them some sort of degree of monopoly power in the labor market. In the labor market, there's also going to be Calvo weight rigidities. And in terms of real rigidities, we also have habits in consumption, investment adjustment costs, and capital utilization costs. Now, one thing to note here is that all of these rigidities will not ultimately affect the long-run consequences of AI adoption, but they will kind of influence the model's short-term dynamics. Then the two remaining agents in the model on top of households and firms are the government and the central bank. For the government, we assume that the expenditures as a share of nominal GDP follow an AR process, and these expenditures are funded by lump sum taxation. And then for the central bank, we will assume that it adjusts the policy rate in response to deviations of inflation from target and deviations from the output gap. As usual, the typical type of Taylor rule, and as usual in these models as well, the output gap is defined as deviation of real GDP from the model's flexible price benchmark. Now, the benchmark model will have 20 industries, as I mentioned, at the two-digit NICE level. We calibrate the model to match key features of the US economy. And for this, we use input-output tables to pin down the waste to capital, labor, industry-specific intermediate inputs in the production functions at the industry level, also the weights of consumption, investment, and government spending in domestic demand, and the weights of each industry in the consumption, investment, and government spending bundles. Then for all of the rest of the parameters that control the dynamic of the model, habits, investment adjustment costs, aggregates, labor supply, elasticity, and so on. These are taken from the literature. I have an annex slide with the table that basically copy-pasted from the paper. You can find it in the paper, and of course the slides can be shared among participants afterwards. We then use the exposure measure to simulate the impact of AI adoption by industries. And here the idea is that we model the effects of AI as a sequence of permanent increases in the level of industry-specific productivity. As I mentioned before, guided by the estimates that we found in the literature, we do this in a way such that the annual impact on total TFP growth aggregates to a value of 1.5 over a decade. Finally, as I hinted at before, as it happens in all of these models, there is going to be forward-looking expectation components in some of the key equations. So we need to take a stance on economic agents, basically households and firms. We need to take a stance on their beliefs about the future path of productivity to solve for the reduced form of the system of equations. And given the high degree of uncertainty on this, we take two extremes. One is when the effects of AI on productivity today and going forward are fully anticipated. And second is when the effects today are seen, but the future effects are not anticipated. So basically, households and firms on every period, they see the productivity today, they act accordingly, but they are systematically surprised by when come tomorrow, they are surprised again by the increasing productivity. Now, reality, of course, will lie somewhere in between. Yes.
We have a question from Sigal.
Yeah, just a small question. What do you assume about the labor market? Is it always in equilibrium, or do you allow unemployment? Because this is something that might be interesting considering the transition.
Yes. So we don't. So there is no unemployment in the model, basically. Just to answer the question. Yeah. So that would introduce. I mean, the model is quite complex as it stands. So this would introduce too much. Of course, this is one of the an important issue. We were more interested in seeing labor reallocation across sectors rather than the effect on unemployment, because I mean, we believe that this is something that we can reasonably speak to, whereas the effect on unemployment would require us to take a stance on, actual displacement, new tasks, issues for which, we would be just widely guessing.
So you can read the effects through the changes in wages, actually. I mean, you can understand what's happening. Okay.
Yeah.
Relative wages.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
So with the model behind, then let me now just go to the macro results, and I start with the unanticipated case. So productivity improvements from AI will lead to significant increase in GDP. As you see, GDP, the growth is fastest, of course, in the first 10 years, because that's the period in which AI directly raises industry level TFP, at which point GDP is almost 30% higher than it would have been without AI adoption. Then it continues to increase even after the direct productivity gains from AI adoption are exhausted, although at a slower pace, because it takes time for firms to adjust their capital stock and then use intermediate inputs to take full advantage of AI. And then the path of aggregate consumption and investment broadly resemble those of GDP. Now, let me say, when I give these numbers, so I don't put, and I hope you don't put, a lot of stock in the actual number, whether it is 30, whether it is 42, or whether it is some other number. So here the idea is to look at more at dynamics and the tendencies on the longer term. The actual numbers, of course, depend a lot on the calibration, and this will could reasonably change. So in this unanticipated scenario, in terms of inflation, we see that AI adoption will initially lower inflation. The idea here is that faster productivity growth increases the economy's productive capacity. This lowers firms' cost, relaxes supply constraints, and therefore acts as a disinflationary force. And the demand response, on the other hand, takes some time to materialize, in part because of the frictions that I mentioned before, habits in consumption, investment adjustment costs, and so on. The policy rates will react accordingly in this initial phase and decline with inflation, and then eventually rise. I mean, over time, then the effects of AI adoption on aggregate demand will start to dominate the effects on aggregate supply. So AI adoption ultimately will raise inflation after a few years. Now, the things are a bit different in the case when households and firms correctly anticipate the entire future path of productivity increases that arise from AI. So here, what we see is that GDP increases a bit more slowly than in the unanticipated case. And this is because households basically bring forward consumption in order to smooth the trajectory over time, which you can see with the flatter orange line in the center panel. And to accommodate this higher consumption, which, by the way, runs ahead of actual AI-induced productivity improvements, then investment has to fall a bit in the short run, relative to the unanticipated case. So then, as a result, then the economy's capital stock grows a bit more slowly than in the unanticipated case, and this results in a lower level of GDP compared to that unanticipated case. Then the path of inflation, interest rates, and the output gap will differ much more notably in this anticipated scenario. Because demand increases in anticipation of future productivity increases, and it increases today, then AI adoption is inflationary already today. And inflation only begins to converge towards the unanticipated scenario as investment becomes positive, and then the productive capacity of the economy gets replenished over time. Policy rates, as you would expect, through the policy rules that are embedded in the model, they would rise immediately as inflation increases, and then decline only after about 10 years, basically following the path of inflation and responding as well to changes in the output gap. So it seems that expectations of the effect of AI can play a key role for the dynamics of the main macro variables in the model. Yet we do not know much about what these expectations are and how do they look like. So here I would like to make a shameless plug for a recent BIS bulletin and a forthcoming journal article that we did with some of the same group of authors, where what we do is we use a module that we added to the New York's Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations to ask US consumers about their views on AI, their use of AI, their knowledge of it, and their expectations in terms of benefits and risks. And here the bottom line is that the expectation is rather positive in the sense that more benefits than risks are anticipated by the US households, at least those that answer the survey. Although there's also a considerable heterogeneity across demographics, most notably in terms of gender, which then led us to write this other short piece on the gender Gen AI gender gap. It's a bit of a mouthful, which of course, if unaddressed, could further contribute to existing gender pay gap and also increase inequality. So a bit going in the direction of some of the previous questions. But again, this is inequality is something that that is not addressed by the model, but at least to have some idea of expectations. So it seems like at least US households are broadly positive in terms of how they see AI. So now let me move to the impacts of AI across industries. Here we are plotting the long run value added across industries, which are color coded into these 5 main categories that I mentioned before. Here there are 3 key takeaways, at least that we could make of this series of graphs. First, output rises in all sectors. This is the hallmark of a general purpose technology that that lifts all boats, as it were. Second, that even though it rises for everyone, there is still substantial variation across industries, where you can see a bit more clustering of some say professional services to the left, and then some of the secondary industries to the right, which is then a third takeaway, which is that some industry groups are clearly benefiting more than others. Now, this last graph that I'm showing is about changes in value added at the industry level. Now, in practice, much of the increase in output of primary and secondary industries will actually be used in downstream industries as intermediate inputs in the production of eventual final goods for households and businesses. So to illustrate this effect, what we do in this figure is decompose the increase in value added by industry into the increase in value added that shows up as final demand. So that's consumption, investment, government expenditure. And then the part that is used as intermediate input by other industries. And then we also break this down further into 2 categories. One is the change due to income effects, so that's higher aggregate demand. And the second one is due to substitution effects, which is changes in relative prices. And then, as you can see, basically income effects matter much more than substitution effects, at least in the baseline calibration of our model. Now, an important message that emerged from our macro analysis is that general equilibrium effects in the longer term tend to be quite large and dominant. So it is, of course, important to account for them. But this has implications beyond the macro analysis, also for the industry analysis. So the first insight that we gain here is that a sector's initial exposure to AI has little relationship to the ultimate increase in value-added output. So this is the one result that I was surprised by the most. I was expecting to see some cluster of points on top of a more or less straight line. Now the reason for this cloud of dots arranged in no particular form is that ultimately, again, general equilibrium effects that arise from higher demand for a sector's output tend to matter much more than the initial increase in productivity, as calibrated from our exposure measure. Our results also show that the ultimate increase in value-added output is going to be smaller in more labor-intensive sectors. And here the idea is that an increase in productivity implies that more output is going to be needed to produce with a fixed amount of labor, which will then raise real wages for that sector. So then the sectors in which labor is a more important factor of production will face higher costs and therefore increase their production by less. A second key takeaway is from the industry analysis that it's also related to the point I just mentioned, which is that differences in labor intensity will translate into movements in relative prices, with the relative prices of labor-intensive industries rising relative to more capital-intensive ones. And this goes again to a question that was there before. And third, AI adoption also leads to a reallocation of labor across industries. So in general, employment will increase in services industries that experience higher relative prices and the smallest increases in value-added output. The idea is that higher selling prices will allow firms in these industries to raise wages more than firms in industries that have relative prices that see the relative prices decline, and this will induce workers to adjust their labor supply towards these industries. In contrast, in the capital-intensive industries that see the largest increases in value added, and then thereby also see relative prices decline by more, then hours worked will fall. So even though we do not assume substitutability or complementarity, we still are able to see some reallocation of labor across sectors. So as I mentioned, yes.
We have one question from Lilach.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Could you please return to slide 16? Go back to the slide.
Yeah.
About the green, the substitution.
Yes.
As I understand, the assumption is that the sector stays as it is, even if it is a disruptive innovation interference, and there is no change in the strategy of the sector, which changes the sector itself. I look for on the education, for example. I understand that according to this analysis, the sector actually stays as an education sector as it is today, and there are not material changes that changes the function, the function of production of the sector. So this is just as a question.
Yes. I think your assessment. Your assessment. Thanks for the question. Your assessment is correct, and I think it goes back to the point that was raised by Itamar, right? Which is that realistically, we can expect the structure of industries to change, and more importantly, new industries to pop up, and maybe some industries to just disappear. And this is something that the model does not speak to. But your interpretation is correct. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Would it be correct to say that the changes you've shown us in inflation are mostly or even all about relative price changes and not, it's not demand because it's a change in supply, it's a TFE shock, so it's mostly relative price changes accommodated by the monetary policy authority rather than, inflation, prolonged inflation we think about when you talk about, inflation for many years or so.
I think it's not just relative prices because at the end of the day,
you said something about demand, anticipatory.
Because at the end of the day, like the force that ends up dominating in the longer term is the demand forces. Is how this pushes demand in the long term. I mean, in the short term, as a TFP shock, you would expect it to be deflationary actually, which is what you see when it is unanticipated, right? So my take is that it's not just changes in relative prices that are cooked up in the model. So it's both, and actually, if anything, is a bit more, the demand kind of coming in full force in the medium to long term, and then dominating basically all of the other effects.
It's like a news shock, right?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Coming to counterfactuals. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we use the model for a couple of counterfactual exercises. In the first one, what we do is we explore the industry variation in terms of the effects of AI. Recall that graph with the gray bars, this baseline calibration, there was not so much variation in the industry exposure measure. So what we do is we try to focus on the impact on output and inflation and consider 4 scenarios, which are distinguished by which is the sector that is being affected. And we assess basically the effects of AI raising productivity only in professional services, only in construction, only in healthcare, or only in manufacturing. We choose the first 3 industries because their output is used primarily either as intermediate inputs, investment goods, or consumption services, respectively. And then we choose manufacturing because basically has a wide diversity in terms of its final output destinations. And then to make the exercises comparable, what we do is we, for each industry, we assume that the increase in productivity growth from AI adoption is going to be equal to this 1.5 that I mentioned early on, divided by the industry share of total value added. And then for comparison, we also add results from a baseline model, which we label, equal in the sense that, there's much equally distributed across sectors. Then all of the rest in terms of the model remains as in the baseline scenario. And this, by the way, shows results for the unanticipated case only for sake of simplicity, basically. So as it turns out, which sector is initially most affected by AI will matter greatly for the response in aggregate output and inflation. Now, of course, output will grow irrespective of which industry the effects of AI concentrate on, but there's going to be still some meaningful cross-industry variation. For example, when the effects of AI affect only professional services or construction, then the long-run impact on output is going to be smaller than when all industries are equally affected. And conversely, if the effect of AI concentrates on, say, healthcare or manufacturing, then the long-run effect on output can be over 1/3 larger than in the kind of quote-unquote equally affected case. Then inflation will display considerably more heterogeneity across the scenarios, even more than or substantially more than output. When the effects of AI concentrate in professional services industry, there's going to be no initial disinflation at all, even though that scenario features the smallest increase in GDP. When it's concentrated only in construction, then the long-run effect on inflation is going to be small, despite an initial very mild disinflation. And then on the other extreme, when the effects concentrate on manufacturing, there's going to be a substantial disinflation early on, and then it will take at least a decade for inflation to become positive. So here, the idea is that the different inflation responses will reflect in part different required paths of relative prices. So the higher productivity in a single industry will lower its relative price. And then when the productivity boost occurs in an industry that accounts for a large share of consumption outputs, say like healthcare, then the relative price adjustment will show up largely in consumer price inflation and higher inflation in the investment goods deflator. In contrast, when the productivity boost will occur in an upstream industry like professional services or construction, then inflation in the investment goods sector deflator will tend to fall significantly, while then the consumer price inflation will decrease only slightly or might even rise. Now, a second counterfactual exercise that we do is, which can itself be divided into two, is we use the model to study the evolution of output and inflation when first when AI is only labor augmenting, and second when AI is only capital augmenting. So we basically get away from this assumption that AI is a general purpose tech. Now, the difference between the alternatives considered are smaller here than in the previous counterfactual exercise. Again, to be sure, there are some qualitative differences in terms of the effect on output. The long-run impact is smaller when AI is factor-specific, especially so for capital augmenting. But regardless of how AI enters the production function, then the long-run impact on output is going to be positive and relatively considerable. And for inflation, there are even less differences across the alternatives, which all show quite similar dynamics. So to wrap up, let me say that what we try to do in the paper is we try to present what, to the best of our knowledge, is the first multi-sector macro model that studies the impact of AI on macro outcomes. And also, because of its multi-sector nature, it allows us to study the effects across industries. This is grounded on a granular measure of the impact of AI across industries and across occupations, and then aggregation based on production structure. We consider AI as a general purpose tech that improves productivity growth differentially across industries. And our analysis shows that it raises output, consumption, investment, and the impact on inflation will depend on how agents in the model form their expectations. With initial disinflation in the unanticipated case, and with inflation throughout in the fully anticipated case. Also, some interesting insights in terms of the effect across industries. So, one, initial sector exposure to AI is uncorrelated with the ultimate impact of AI on that sector's output, because indirect effects through spillover, linkages, demand are what matters at the end of the day. However, for aggregate output, which sectors are initially most affected by AI is important, as our counterfactual exercise, first counterfactual exercise shows. When the effects of AI concentrate on sectors that produce consumption rather than investment goods, then output can grow by twice as much. Of course, it goes without saying, a lot of additional work is needed here, stress testing many of the assumptions. As always, there are plenty of caveats with regards to the specifications of the model, the assumptions, the calibration, and so on and so forth. Yet we think that we provide a tool that is reasonably grounded on first principles, both empirical and theoretical. helps us a bit discipline our thinking about these issues which are of great importance to the central banking community, while at the same time remaining quite open and humble given the high degree of uncertainty surrounding the impact of AI. So with that, let me wrap up, and I'm happy to take any other questions on this paper or the other papers that we have been putting out, or I understand from Itamar there's going to be a bit of a free-flowing discussion on BIS work later as well. So thanks again, everyone, for your time and attention. Let me leave it at that.
Thanks, Iñaki. It was fascinating, as expected. This was anticipatory. We have a few questions. I see one hand. Yossi, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting paper and topic. Following the question of Sigal about unemployment. Now, I understand there's no unemployment in the model, but there are quite a few frictions, and at least in the context of AI or generally TFP shock, this is a permanent shock, I would start the analysis maybe in the long run and less, I'm not sure about monetary policy in this context, although it definitely has implication for inflation and monetary policy. The thing that is a bit, at least to me, looked a bit weird reaction is the positive inflationary effect when the shock is anticipated. And of course, I understand the mechanism, consumption goes up. But in this context, and going back to Sigal comment, I think maybe the most, in my view, the most relevant friction that, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not present in the model, is the transition of labor across industries. If I understand correctly, there's free flow of labor, there's no friction there. And I think what was in Sigal's mind was that, okay, there's this shock, some people find themselves out of work because they're not skilled enough. Because the technology replaces them, and they cannot just quickly move to the sectors with high demand that maybe utilize better this new technology. So, in my view, I think it would be interesting, especially for the short run implications, to add this kind of friction. Maybe some other frictions are less important. I think that this would definitely would reduce the rise in consumption on impact, because there will be a bunch of workers that just lose their job, and their income or wealth will decline. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is a great question. So why not start the analysis in the long run? And I mean, the key thing that we wanted to add to study when we started this project was basically to see where inflation might be going because of monetary policy, right? So that's even though we don't make a lot about the monetary policy graphs in the paper and in the presentation as well, that was kind of the initial motivation. So in terms of the friction that you mentioned, I think you did also a nice job in putting your colleagues' previous comment into a broader context to help me understand it a bit better. So I think you're right. Of course, our model does not speak to that directly. This is something that I'm going to take to the rest of the team and see to what extent we can expand it along those dimensions. Now, one clarification that I wanted to make is that it's not just consumption going up. It's just that because consumption goes up, investment has to be reduced, and then there is an opening of actually quite substantial opening of the output gap, and this is what generates. So basically, at the end of the day, it's kind of a temporary mismatch between aggregate demand and supply. So it's not just not just consumption. Now, in terms of reallocation across labor and frictions, as I mentioned, our measure. So in terms of narrative, we can always say like, okay, people's skills in some occupations are going to be degraded, and then it's going to take them time. There's going to be some degree of skills mismatch to begin with, and then this is going to be, you know, sanding the wheels of adjustment. I don't think we can really model skills mismatch, but we can introduce some sort of friction in principle. Yeah, this is a good point. I will take it to the team and then see to what extent we can continue to complicate the model in more directions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now we have a question from Lilach.
Today I'm very active because it's very interesting, and I'm also from the financial sector of our team. So with respect to the consumption, we know that when the credit card was introduced to the market, then there was an impact on the consumption. And we understand that the digitization is also contributes to the now this is a kind of a regulatory or maybe a governmental question of policy with respect to frictions and limitations on the consumption. So this is one of the open questions. Do you have like a forecast of the impact of the consumption that is realistic and reflects a rational consumer versus consumption that is becoming not rational, and it's impacted by the fact that it's more easy, it's digital, and etc. Or there are all kinds of measures to tempt the consumer to consume more, especially with externalities.
Okay, I mean, just to be clear, this is a question that goes straight out of the model, right? So it's not something that the model can speak to really.
Unless you add to the model regulatory measures to balance the consumption. So it will reflect just the rational part of the
yes. I mean, yeah, I guess we could do that, but then this introduces a question of why would I mean, it's a big judgment call, right, from the model builder to say
exactly.
Consumption is bad, and therefore I'm going to cap it.
Yeah, this is the question. Yeah.
I would actually not venture into that because to me, so we try to do this with as least judgment as possible. That's why also we didn't want to venture into saying like some occupations are going to be completely replaced, some others are going to be like fully complementary. We wanted to be as non-judgmental as possible, and then simulate the model based on the more kind of hands-off approach that we could. So
but then you might miss in the model the side of the not rational part of the economy.
Yes, I think that's fair enough.
The behavioral side will not be implemented in the model, so it will be a model, classical model without behavioral biases.
Well, I mean, there are some frictions, like there is habits in consumption as well, for example, not just to mention one. So there are some frictions in the model already to try to capture some of these things, but I don't think we can capture, you know, the fact that digitally provided services tend to lure more consumption, or to elicit higher consumption that you would have for a similar service but delivered non-digitally. For example, I don't think this is something that we can satisfactorily capture with the model.
Thank you. Next question, Jonathan.
Yes. Thank you very much, Iñaki, for this excellent presentation. I just have I have one comment and one question. So the first comment is related to your classification of industries. I think there is someone at the École Polytechnique in France who has done the same work, or not the same, of course, but a more empirical work classifying in France the effect of AI on various sectors. So I don't remember the reference. I will send you by email, but I think it's worth watching. So my question is more, maybe it's probably a very stupid question, but I want to ask it because it's fascinating me how we in economics ignore the effect of utility functions and why we don't have any effect in the utility function of AI. I'm wondering, so okay, so you are on the production function, you have the productivity shock, and you include the, if I understood well, the model, the effect of AI through the production function. But why not including that in the N, in the big N in labor supplied by the households? I mean, if I'm using more ChatGPT, for instance, then I'm able to provide more work. Maybe it's a stupid question, but I just would like to hear you about that.
Well, I don't think it's a stupid question. I mean, it's but there are two distinct things. So one is how much utility it generates for you as a consumer, and another one is how much productive does it make you. And to the extent that it's the second one, that's the one we capture. And I think that's because that's a way in which basically general purpose technologies have been studied in the past, right? And we think, much like the rest of the people in this literature, we think that AI is a general purpose technology, much like the internet, much like the electricity. And at the end of the day, this increases production efficiency, productivity in some sectors more than others, in some occupations more than others. But it's not. It hasn't been modeled as increasing your utility, even though admittedly you are currently getting some utility from having that light on, right, and not working darkly or having internet access or and so on and so forth for different reasons that are kind of non-productivity related. But on this, I would say the standard has been always to look at this from the production side of the economy, because at the end of the day, this is the kind of thing that you can measure in terms of how more productive you can become, with caveats. You can measure it, whereas how much utility you get from electricity, the internet, or maybe ChatGPT now, in a way that is not captured by the fact that you are able to write a memo faster, which would go into productivity, right? So it would be whatever the complement to that is. It's very hard to capture and to measure.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I mean, I understand your reply, but I'm still with this question. Like, but I understand. I mean, it's legitimate and really. I'm just with this question. So some people. So look how I'm thinking. Some people are illusioned by the fact they use an AI to think instead of themselves, and then they think they work more, but at the end they provide the same work. So the production function is the same. The productivity, of course, is higher for him, but at the end, at the macro level, we don't see this reflected in the production function, but yes, in the utility function. Why? Because they spend more leisure and they are happy to use that because they've made less effort. I understand it's related to productivity, but this kind of illusion is not modeled, and that's why I asked this question. But
fair enough.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time. I will finish with a suggestion for a quote for a paper. I think it was Bill Gates that said that most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10 years. So that's a third scenario you can think about.
Yeah.
Maybe I guess that's more realistic than just anticipating or not. So thanks, Iñaki. It was a great presentation, and yeah, we hope to see you in person as soon as possible.
Yeah, thanks a lot to all of you for the invitation and for the questions and being engaged. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye bye.